Okay. We're going to go ahead, I think, and get started. I'm going to just check to see how many people are on the recording. I see some familiar faces. Welcome, everybody. I'm just making sure that everybody's here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started just with a few preliminaries. I'm Tracy Crum. I'm the Director for Artistic Advancement at Textile Center, and want to thank you for joining us today for another one of our lunchtime Zoom sessions. I'm going to just talk about a couple of Zoom procedures first off, and that is that we request everyone to please keep themselves muted during the conversation so that the moderator and the panelists can have full reign of the abilities of Zoom and keep the panel flowing smoothly. If you have questions, we welcome you to share the questions in the chat room. We will be pulling your questions out of the chat room at the end of the conversation to share with the audience and to share with the panelists so that they can get some of their questions to you directly. So I think that's good. If you have any, as a audience participant, if you have any questions about what's happening or if you're having any difficulties, technical difficulties, you can just send me a message in the chat room and I will see it and I will do my best to respond. So without further ado, I'm going to formally get this started. So I want to welcome everybody to Roots of Our Labor. Roots of Our Labor is the Jerome Fiber Artist Project Grant Exhibition and panel discussion for this group of 2019-2020 grantees. The program, the grantee program at Textile Center showcases the work of 3-year-long supported fiber art grant projects, which are funded by the Jerome Foundation. So we want to give special thanks today to the participating artist grantees. That's Ian Hanesworth, John Tomlinson, and Erin Lavelle, and to our moderator, Pat Hickman, who has been a long-standing leader in the field of contemporary fiber arts and Professor Emeritus at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, and also a member of the Textile Center's National Artist Advisory Council. So we welcome all of you and thank you for agreeing to participate in the panel discussion today about your work. I also want to pay a special thanks today to the Jerome Foundation, who has made this program possible for emerging fiber artists in the state of Minnesota. The Jerome Fiber Artist Project Grant for Emerging Artists has funded the work of now 40 fiber artists in the state of Minnesota and has been supporting their work since 2008. Textile Center has received a total of 11 years of program support from the Jerome Foundation, and they've all culminated in exhibitions such as the one that you will see virtually during the Zoom discussion, and we are encouraging visitors to Textile Center by appointment. You can come and actually see the exhibition through at least the end of August in person. Let's see, we want to just thank everybody for joining us today to celebrate the artists and their new studio work, supported through this incredible funding opportunity that we've had from the Jerome Foundation. So welcome to everyone. I am going to tap out for the rest of the session and turn it over to Pat Hickman.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd like to start by congratulating these 3 emerging artists. I wish so much that I could be in the gallery and you could be in the gallery and we could meet in the old-fashioned way. This somehow feels as if it's a whole other way of getting to know you and your work. And one day I hope I'll have that opportunity to really be in the same space with you. It's been wonderful to have this glimpse virtually of your work, and I would like to begin by asking just some questions that my hope is that we can just have a dialogue back and forth, that you can ask each other questions, that we can have this be a conversation. But to get it started, I think I'd like to ask a general question, and maybe each of you could then, in your response, think of one piece that perhaps you can focus on and be specific in terms of talking about it in response to the question. So my question is, how does the form, the textile technique, the process that you're using, how does that relate to what you have to say? And maybe you can just think of, one of the pieces that you have in the gallery and how it particularly responds to those ideas. So the form, the textile technique, and the process, how does that, you feel, really relate to what you have to say? Ian, would you like to begin, please?
Hi, I'm Ian. As a response to the question about the relationship between form and concept, I could talk about any of these pieces, but maybe I'll talk about the urn piece, which is the second image. My grant project over the last year has involved hand making cordage out of wild plant fibers. So it's this really slow, small technique of hand cording fibers, which for this exhibition, I mostly used basswood and nettle fiber. So this process of making cordage was that was my project. That was where the concept lied. So there really isn't a lot of distinction between concept and process and material. It's all really inextricable. Cordage making is an incredibly old process. It's older than spinning. It is one of the most ancient technologies that is relevant to all cultures, including my ancestors, but specifically is more closely tied to indigenous peoples today. And yeah, so it's a really, really slow labor. And it's very meditative, and the labor also involves going out and harvesting. And that was a huge part of my project, is creating a project and a process where harvesting and hiking and foraging was a big part of the concept and the process of making art.
Okay, thank you. Dawn, could you respond to that same question, please?
Sure, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, how does the form, the textile technique, and the process, how does that relate to what you have to say, or that you're trying to say in your work?
Okay, I'm gonna concentrate on the covering, which is that top piece that you see. When I began, this was not what I envisioned, but it was actually the second piece I constructed. And as I went through my research about the Camptowns and how personal that was to me and my birth mother, having been born in Korea near the DMZ, I kept coming back to how many Camptowns there were. And I was trying to figure out how to let my audience know how that felt so impactful to me, both as a piece of history and as something very personal. And I came up with listing as many Camptowns that I could find a record of. And there is an indication that's not the entire record, but that is what my research led me to. And so I listed every single one on this piece of fabric. And I thought if I could present to people how many there were and how I kept writing and writing, and they're listed there, how it would add up in one visual image. And after I did that, I embroidered some of the names that those Camptown women were called. So these women lived near the military base and were part of the culture just around the US military bases in Korea. They often did such innocent things as laundry, but they were also in those bars and entertainment places for the soldiers. And so there is a question about my mother because I haven't found her, was she actually a Camptown woman or was she not a Camptown woman? But if she were, and statistically it's likely that she was, then what was her life like? And in Korea, the very people that she lived amongst would have called her these terrible names. So I embroidered them in red. For some reason, the image of blood came to mind, and that image stayed with me through the next few pieces. So the embroidery reflects the Korean name that was derogatory, and then the Western American interpretation. So Western princess, Western whore were some of the derogatory names translated. And the netting that surrounds this piece is broken. And I felt she was caught up in this net of her circumstances, but it was a broken net because it didn't serve her well if she were a Camptown woman. It didn't serve any of these women well. And then as I was making the netting, it just really envisioned for me a sense of my own roots, being possibly the child of one of these women, because I am half Korean and half Caucasian. And we were all caught up in this net of circumstances of poverty in Korea, of living near a camp town, and they were called villages. So just by proximity, we were caught up in this net, not of our own making. And because Korea was so homogenous in racial identity at that time, mixed race children were not accepted, and that's how many of us ended up being adopted to America.
Thank you, Dawn. I mean, I think one of the things that speaks to me about your work and all three of you is that you really are addressing and confronting personal stories that matter a lot to you, and trying to convey that visually. And to me, that seems part of what makes what you're doing so powerful. Erin, could you comment on those same questions in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you see in the virtual gallery of Impermanence Practice Group is really just a snapshot moment in time of where this project was at the moment of installing it. This project for me was really about the process itself. I'm working with the topic and the concept and the philosophy of impermanence, and the whole point of this was to enact that through art. So I worked on creating this in the public libraries, starting at Eastlake Library, which is my neighborhood library, and I invited people to work on it with me, not knowing how in any moment the project may change shape. So you can see that it's very unfinished. So there are cuts that have been made that have not been sewn up and repaired. There are pieces that have started and are left unfinished. Also, as time went on and the pandemic happened, of course, I was no longer able to work in the libraries with people. And I continued my solo practice at home. And then with the murder of George Floyd and the following uprising, the Eastlake Library is just a block away from the 3rd Precinct where everything was burned down. And I started working with that moment of impermanence and gathering objects from the neighborhood that were left scattered on the sidewalks and on the hillsides near the Greenway where I bike every day. So I don't actually know what will happen with this next once it's out of the gallery, but it really is an ever-changing garment, and we are practicing impermanence every day and every moment, and that is what I was really trying to get at with this piece, just allowing it to change, welcoming the change, dealing with the change, sitting with whatever discomfort comes in the moment. I remember a day in the library where someone wanted to cut off the sleeve. And so that just happened. The sleeve was cut off, and then, a few days later, it became, sewn as a pocket on the inside. So just working with impermanence is what you see in this garment.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me to think about how the focus of your piece was impermanence, was change, and then the whole world changed around it. It's as if, I mean, you didn't cause it to change, but it's like nothing more could have happened almost. Tell me a little bit about what's weighting it down at the bottom. Can you say something about that? It's hard to read it in the image.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are bricks from a burned down building, and they're all from one building, Uncle Hugo's bookstore, science fiction bookstore on Lake Street. And these bricks had just tumbled down the hill of the Greenway, and they're charred, and also inside of them I've tucked in burnt pieces of books. They're little tiny bits and pieces of paper that I found scattered all through the grass, and I loaded it all up on a bike trailer and biked it home, which was quite a feat. But this kind of rubble, was present in my neighborhood and all along Lake Street for weeks. This isn't something I collected the day after the building was burned down. There was simply too much to be picked up in an efficient fashion. Mm-hmm. So, this is the scenery of our neighborhood.
Yeah. No, it speaks of place, it seems to me, as much as change and impermanence. Because in the title of this exhibit, Roots of Our Labor, the word roots is there. Is there anything more that any of you would say about the presence of the past in your work? I mean, I think you referred to it a little bit, but do you feel roots are part of your work? And that may refer to the culture that you were born into, or the culture that you feel you're part of now. But it feels to me like that word roots is sort of, a core word in the exhibit, in the title for sure. But I just wonder if in your thinking, you see that as something that you think about as you're working or imagining what you have to say. So anybody have any more that you would say about that?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think the title, it speaks a lot to each of our practices in a slightly different way. So I think we might each have something to say about it. Yeah. But as far as cultural roots, I can go back to what I said before about cordage being so old, such an old technology, and how it's kind of at the roots of textile work is cordage, and that root hinges on a very close working relationship with plants, with harvesting, with processing. This technology came about when the creation of textiles was like also the cultivation of relationship with the land. So in my work, I'm thinking about cultural roots, but I'm literally also thinking about plant roots, about rooting down, rooting in place, getting to know these plants, learning how their fibers are at different times of the year, how they react after you harvest from them. So yeah, that's a little bit of how it relates to my practice. I don't know if Dawn and Erin want to add to that.
Yeah, I would also, I think of netting as survival skill, and it just feels to me like that's really part of your thinking. It's also part of Dawn's in the use of netting. It feels like it's such a fundamental knowledge that people around the world had. And
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead, Dawn, do you want to say more about roots or anything else you'd add to that question?
I guess I would just add that, like any Korean adoptees, there is a period of separation from our birth culture when we are adopted to a foreign country, which includes Europe, America, even Australia. And as we rediscover those roots, there is an element of finding your roots in a different way than perhaps other people. You can't go directly to your relatives because all of your relatives are not your birth relatives, and in fact not even in the same country. You aren't an immigrant, so you haven't come to America with your family. And so to reunite with your roots, there is an element of removal, of detachment, of rediscovering it through this filter that we struggle with, and getting caught up in the netting. And the netting that I made is purposely not perfect, because getting caught up in all of this is not perfect for any of us. And I wanted that reflected.
Yeah. I remember, Dawn, when I was at the Textile Center last, I think you just come back from Korea, and you had brought some handkerchiefs that you purchased in Korea. And we talked about, some of them looked like bandanas, or at least reminded me of bandanas. I don't know if you remember this, but there was that sense of, you seemed excited about those and possibly using them as an art material. And I just wondered if that was still part of your thinking, or if that's just sort of tucked away for something else. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely. It's in my mind working itself through. Definitely. Yes. And I kept collecting them without any real thought why, but our conversation definitely instigated those thoughts for me. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it felt like there was a kind of binational dialogue that could happen through that. And I just was curious to know if you still were tucking those away. Yeah. Erin, what about you in terms of roots and anything more you would add about that?
Yeah, well, my project is definitely rooted in a mindfulness practice, but beyond that, it's very much about my grandmother. My grandma Ruby was a seamstress, and she labored full time until she was 89 years old, which is incredible. And she spent her career doing alterations and repairs. And so as a little kid, I would sit in her office, essentially her sewing studio office, and watch her fix things all day long. So that very much has influenced a lot of my work, including this, in which things get changed and altered and repaired and taken apart and put back together again.
Yeah, and the notion of mending right now just seems so timely in terms of what our world needs. It just feels as if it is a way of working that I think a lot of artists are using now. Just feeling that it's the appropriate way to think about addressing the kind of repair that has to happen. Yeah. Another question I wondered about, if you think about the word appropriation or the word appreciation, do either or both of those words relate to your work? Can you sort of think of your work in relation to either one of those? Ian, could you respond to that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this is something that's been on my mind at length throughout this project. I am a descendant of white settlers on stolen indigenous land, and I'm working with plants and techniques that are really relevant to the indigenous cultures that still live here today. And through my research, I've researched quite a bit of cordage making and where it came from and how the different techniques existed in different cultures around the world. and thought a lot about the role of appropriation and appreciation, and understanding that cordage making was relevant to my ancestors, but it was many, many hundreds of years ago that it was relevant to them. And it was in a very different place. It was in Eastern Europe rather than the land where I live today. So this is definitely something I am continuing to have conversations about. I have not, like, I have no solid answers. It is something that we all need to consider through making work. I'm always harvesting, and the act of harvesting on stolen land, what I'm trying to do by including acknowledgments in my didactics is just, if nothing else, I can acknowledge the history, acknowledge what my role here is, and hopefully honor the peoples that came before as stewards of this land.
In your harvesting process, is there a ritual that you go through that you've sort of felt was appropriate for you before you take your materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do have my own little rituals. I like to sit with the plants. Usually I'll harvest nettle from one big stand of nettle that grows across from where my parents live. So I'll sit with the nettles, try to be mindful and present, and receive information and express my intentions. And I say thank you every time I harvest a plant, which maybe sounds a little silly, but I try to make that a big part of my practice, and I try to give something back. I try to give a gift, so I'm not just taking. And I haven't figured out exactly what the most appropriate gift is, but often I give water. I bring water to the plants I harvest from. I never harvest from live basswood trees. I only harvest downed branches, which are then incorporated into other sculptures. But even dead basswood trees, I mean, they're still living. There's still fungi and bacteria actively decomposing them. So it's necessary that even though they're not living on a tree or part of a living tree, like, I still find it necessary to express gratitude. So yeah, gratitude is, I guess, the biggest part of my harvesting ritual.
Yeah, thank you. And Erin, how would you respond to those words, appropriation or appreciation?
Yeah, well, certainly I'm appropriating my grandmother's mending practice for my art form. I had never thought about it that way until you asked that question. I also have an extreme appreciation for plants as well. I've been a vegetarian since I was 10 years old, and I'm a gardener. And on this fabric, I did an eco-printing process of plant material. So it's essentially a printmaking process where you pull the tannins from plants and print them onto the fabric. And I was really, I harvested some things from my own garden and yard to do this, but I also really loved the effect that sage has, because it's so squishy that you can get a very wide range of effects for the printmaking. And so I was speaking with one of my Indigenous friends who works for Dream of Wild Health, which is an Indigenous farm in Hugo, Minnesota. And she suggested that I use culinary sage really specifically. And I thanked her for that wisdom and insight and knowledge, and actually went out to the farm and, met with the folks who are growing there and purchased a large bundle of culinary sage to use. I wanted to be very careful and specific not to use a medicinal or a sacred sage that would normally be used for burning and for practices that are certainly not my own.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if you can see from the pictures, all of the green imprints are from plant material.
Yeah.
If you have an opportunity to see it up close, you'll get a better view.
Yeah, and in those banners that were hanging up above,
Mm-hmm.
you must have examples of that in those.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, that's all printed.
Right, right. Okay. And Dawn, any further response from you about what I've just asked?
You know, from the very beginning, even proposing the project, I'm very mindful that the beadwork I do is really a nod to contemporary beadwork and not to a traditional Korean method. And yet, I grew up in America and this is my medium. So there was a time for me to try to reconcile that within myself.
Mhm.
But for me, this was the best form of expression that I know. I did spend about 4 days in Korea with In Suk Choi. And I don't know if anyone remembers, but she had an exhibition with her bajagi at the Textile Center, I believe, last summer. I was able to spend 4 days with her as in a classroom situation where I was learning bajagi, which is traditional Korean stitching, kind of, it's become very popular. So it can be worked in organza or silk or mochi, which is a rami material. In the back of my mind, I think that was just settling there because although I didn't work with mochi or a traditional Korean stitch, there is a similar stitch used in the Who is My Oma
Yeah.
project. This one right there, yes.
Mm.
The red stitching is very reminiscent of a stitch used in bajagi. And so there was that nod to that. And yet again, because I'm removed, I'm coming back to my own culture in a kind of roundabout way. And I'm getting there. And my goal is to someday incorporate more of the bajagi as my roots, but I'm not quite there yet, and I haven't had the practice of using it enough. And so it is a nod of my appreciation to my roots and being able to spend time with In Suk Choi. But also, I feel a little bit like I am appropriating certain things when I do my work, and I'm very aware of that.
Yeah, I think being aware and just raising it as a question seems important to me. I mean, I was really interested, Ian, in your basswood piece. When I first looked at it, I thought, has she carved the image of netting into the basswood? And I have collaborated with termites in Australia. I did a piece on top of a huge termite mound where I netted a cap, and I netted it out of hog casings, sausage casings. And it lasted quite a while. This was in a residency. And then one night a dingo came and ate it. And anyway, I love the idea that, you were collaborating with these creatures that were part of life, part of the plant, part of, and I just wondered, is that another direction that you're thinking of sort of going in the future? Or was this kind of a one-time thing that you responded to what you saw, that you were given, and, you appreciated it?
That's a really great question. Thank you for noticing that. So in that piece, which might be hard to see from the image, I did carve an image of netting into the piece, and throughout the whole piece of wood, there's little tunnels and caverns that termites made. And I've been fascinated with those tracks, and it's just like evidence that someone lived there. So I really enjoyed making that piece, and it feels like a starting off point for more pieces. A large part of my practice, aside from cordage making, is relief printmaking. So I do a lot of carving. So this came really naturally, and I'm excited to do more. I am hoping this is a project that's hasn't even quite started yet, but I'm hoping to harvest some pieces of wood from ash trees with evidence of the emerald ash borer and try to make prints of that. So yeah, they're definitely hoping to collaborate with bugs a little more in the future.
Yeah, good. And Dawn, I was really interested in your, sort of listing the large number of Camptown names. And it's an interesting thing to think about. How do you show the cumulative weight, the cumulative power of numbers and many of something? And you talked about in your statement the huge number of Hapa children, that were adopted. And, I just wonder if there's a way you imagine visualizing the enormity and the scale of the numbers of Hapa children that were brought to the US to be adopted.
Oh my goodness. I think the best way to describe that is that I have been very fortunate to go on a tour. We were the very first tour to Korea of Hapa adoptees in 2014. And to realize as we gathered how different we looked, how our genetic combinations expressed themselves so differently among us, and how different our stories were. And that was only 25 of us. And then to imagine that multiplied by thousands and tens of thousands was a little mind-boggling.
Yeah. Anyway, it's an important thing, obviously, that you're so aware of, that I think might spill into work in the future. I look forward to seeing what all of you are going to do in the future, because it seems to me you're at such an exciting place of this beginning and serious commitment to your work. It feels to me like you've been a really strong, supportive community for each other through this Jerome, support. And I'm wondering, do you have ideas of how you can continue this connection? Or are there other people, other fellow artists in the textile community whom you feel can be there in the way that you've had, either through being together in this experience, or that you can carry into the future? I'd sort of like to hear you, that mutual support and sense that someone else out there has an idea of what you're trying for or what you're doing, so that you're not alone, seems important. And I just would like to hear you say a little bit about kind of how you look ahead to finding or creating that support as a continuity after this. Anybody? Erin, would you comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. I feel like the three of us have been in really wonderful conversation and communication throughout this process. Even though our work is very, very different, we are having a lot of similar themes intersect throughout our work. And I would love to continue just talking as a group and engaging on new projects. I also find I'm primarily a public artist. And so I have my sort of public art collaborators sphere, but it's very different to be working in a group of studio artists. And I've really enjoyed sort of jumping the fence over to that side and learning from both Ian and Dawn about that practice and about even just gallery exhibitions. It's not something that I regularly do. Mm-hmm. So I feel like for me, it's been a very good co-learning experience.
Great. Yeah. And Dawn?
Well, we started meeting from the very beginning, almost as soon as we heard about our acceptance. I think the use of the word cohort was extremely inspiring for me, because it did indicate from the beginning that we would be working together. And so we've been meeting throughout the year, over casual meals and coffee and, dare I say, beer. And it's been really inspiring to hear how the three of us would speak about our own art and then come to a middle ground where we found commonality. And for me, that's a really exciting process, because I'm all about where can we meet in the middle? Where do we find a way we can connect? And I felt like this, I really can't imagine a better experience than what we've had.
That's exciting. Yeah. And Ian, any other comments you have?
Yeah, I can second everything that's already been said. And the experience of being in a cohort has been like one of the most positive parts of this grant project. I feel like we have been really mutually supportive of each other through all of this. And we couldn't meet, or we didn't meet in person for a good chunk, a critical chunk there. And I really wish that we could have, but we also were able to figure out other ways, like Zoom, of like connecting and sharing ideas. And I so love the title we came up with. I know we already talked about that, but that felt like a really collaborative process of coming up with that title. And I just love how it speaks to all of our work in such specific but different ways, that just like the title really kind of sums up the like collaborative, collective nature of this process. And I really hope we can stay in touch and continue having conversations. And the next time Erin holds a public engaged project, I hope I get to be a part of it. And I hope I can learn some beadwork from Dom at some point. We had all hoped to teach workshops this summer through the Textile Center, but because of COVID and the specific nature of our projects, it didn't work out, but I hope that can in the future.
No, it seems as if you've had a really unique shared experience, particularly during this time, you know, that who would have guessed that all of this could have happened, and the change that you had to face that was separate from what you proposed maybe at the beginning. Anyway, it's been wonderful to meet you and see what you do. I would like to see if there are chat questions that other people have for you, or if you have anything else for each other. I just feel in the interest of time, we should open it up to other people.
So this is Tracy. And I want to just put a question out there from the chat room that's been in my mind, and partly, because I, on the administrative end of things, saw how COVID impacted all of our planning. I mean, I think, you guys were all on a timeline to be complete with your projects so that we could open in May, I think it was, and so, your practices were pretty severely altered, I think, in some ways, by the middle of March. So can you guys just, I think we're interested too, how did your practices change? How is it changing the way you think about your studio practice right now with so many unknowns moving into the future? Yeah, if you could touch on that a little bit, that'd be great.
I can begin. I think my project was probably the most severely impacted by COVID, simply because it was meant to be made in public spaces with strangers, sharing scissors and needles and thread, which you lick, So, of course, I worked for quite a while at the East Lake Library. And then I moved on to the Sumner Library, and I was only there one day before I had to stop the public engagement process. And I was supposed to eventually move on to the Central Library downtown. And so, first of all, I missed out on interacting with two entire communities that had been planned and worked out with the librarians and staff. And I had to figure out what does it mean to be a public artist during a public health crisis? And I certainly can't answer that question yet. I'm still working on that every day. But I had to shift gears and figure out, how do I continue this project without being able to be in the space with strangers? So I did a few Zoom sessions and invited people to come and go. I tried to recreate them as closely as possible to my library experience, which is a 4-hour period of time where people can just come and go when they please. So I was at home and people were popping in and out of my Zoom sessions when they felt like it. Ultimately, I decided that what I really needed to do is shift to a solo practice and just let what was going on in the world influence the way that I continued working on it by myself. So I would sometimes watch Democracy Now! While I was working and sort of get a state of what's going on with the pandemic globally, not just in my neighborhood. And I'm still really struggling with, what does this mean for the future of public art? I know there's this whole other shift that's happening with all the murals all over town, which I think is wonderful. And also, as a white artist, I am taking a step back. It's, not my time to lead art making in public space. So I'm listening and pausing and going a little more quiet, I guess, with my making.
I can speak next to that. My project was not affected in the same way as Erin's, because I was largely working in my studio or at home. But during the quarantine, like the official shelter in place, I wasn't able to access my studio because it's a shared space in a shared building with shared bathrooms and kitchen. So I decided that wasn't safe at the time. And that coincided with spring, and it also shifted my focus from like being in the studio and making work to being in the woods and harvesting materials. So I felt that I was really present with the spring this year in a way I haven't been otherwise. I was really watching the slow transitions of things bloom as I harvested materials and made cordage. And I'm grateful for that time. It was incredibly difficult, but it was also, there was space there that I haven't always found a space otherwise in my life. Something else I was aware of was some other artists that I'm friends with, the supply chains that they buy materials from were impacted, so they weren't able to get what they needed. And it sort of just reinforced this decision to pursue a project that operates like outside of consumer and production systems by only using wild materials, because my access to those supply chains weren't interrupted. Like nettles continued to grow and basswood continued to grow and dandelions were sprouting and milkweed was rotting. And so that those processes, that kind of resilience was really, really inspiring and really affirming to keep working with wild materials. I wrote some notes. I'm trying to look. Oh, also, in January, I started holding really informal workshops where I taught people how to make cordage, and we talked about our relationship to land and our relationship to plants. And I was so excited about continuing those. And I had some planned for March, and I had some more formal workshops planned as well. And those couldn't happen. But I'm trying to dream up a way of doing really small scale projects, like maybe inviting a few people to like come walk through the gallery at the Textile Center and then go make cordage in the park. Like that is a format I'm thinking of and trying to envision a way that sharing these skills can be safe and socially responsible, because I really feel like these practices of harvesting and working with plants become even more meaningful to me when I can share them with other people.
Yeah, that's good. Don, anything about how it affected your practice?
Well, speaking of supply chains, when I first began, I had this vision I was going to work in a lot of white beads. So at the beginning, I purchased a lot of white beads. And then my focus changed and my designs changed and my thought processes changed. I ended up using a lot of orange and red. And I went through my supply of orange and red and right at a critical point. And so I ordered at the very beginning of March. And by the time my order hit my supplier, they had been shut down by the post office. So the post office refused to let them ship. And because of that, their business came to a halt and they laid people off indefinitely. And there I was with all these pieces in process with all of these red and orange beads. And so fortunately, we weren't able to have the show begin in May because I'm not quite sure what I would have done. I was scrambling how to finish. Yeah. And the extra time did allow those beads to finally be shipped to me so that I could complete the pieces. But yes, that was probably my most challenging part of it, because if things had gone according to schedule, I would have been fine. I was just finishing things up. The other thing that happened is, as I'm facing this challenge of what do I do, I hadn't completed the pieces and I thought, well, should I shift my focus a bit? And I had considered starting another piece about the racial part of the Camptowns. And then George Floyd, the Georgia Floyd death happened, sadly. But it really reiterated for me, and I'm just going to bring up a piece of the research I found that became even more focused for me. And that is, and I believe it was in the book Sex Among Allies that I read, which points out that in the Camptowns, there were bars for white soldiers and there were bars for the black soldiers. And once you were a woman who worked in the bars for the black soldiers, you were not allowed to cross back into the bar that served the white soldiers. You were branded as one of those women who worked in a bar for the black soldiers. And so, as you can imagine, the Hapa children that were Caucasian were actually held in a different status than the Hapa children who were half Korean and half black.
Wow. I was just listening to an interview by a writer who's talking a lot about the word caste, and that there's a caste system that is still such a part of our country. And anyway, we'll be hearing more, I think, about it from her and others. But really extraordinary. I think finally we're awake. We're hearing. We're learning. We're paying attention to our history, and that research that you did seems really important to know.
Yeah.
Are there more chat questions for the artists? Tracy, any others?
Sorry about that. There haven't been, let's see, I've answered a few of them on the chat room. There've been some questions about social media links for all of you so that people can continue to follow your work, and we will make sure that those stay online and updated as you guys get them to us. And then I'll let everybody know that we do record these Zoom sessions, and they will be linked to the Art Speaks and to the virtual exhibition page, so that anyone who has missed a session or wants to come back and take a look at the work or listen to any of the conversation again, you'll be able to access those hopefully early next week. I'm going to give a shout out to Ray, because Ray has been helping me keep an eye on the chat room. Is there anything else that anyone wants to share, or that anyone has shared, or anything anyone else wants to contribute before we wrap up in the next couple minutes?
Do the artists have any questions for each other at this point?
I have a question for my cohort. I would like to ask Erin. I can control my work so closely, Erin. I have total control over what happens. And so what you do seems exactly the opposite of that. I'm just curious how you, for instance, felt after someone cut that sleeve off.
That was actually really an exciting moment for me because because there were so many, it's so funny. There's so many adults who would come and sit with me and talk and engage in discussion about impermanence, but who were afraid to make a cut, or who were afraid to make a stitch, or who were afraid to do something that they considered wrong. Or something that frequently came up was, well, I don't want to change something that somebody else worked really hard on, which was so interesting to me. And the day that the sleeve got cut off was so exciting. I just thought, oh, wow, like, this is bold, you know? I will say, like, to your point, though, it is hard to give up control. It is hard to release control. But that is life, and that is something we have to practice every single day. And I really am someone who believes that art making has to be integrated into the way we live our lives. Mm-hmm. And so this study on impermanence, I feel, is really difficult and something that will never be finished.
Yeah. That's a hard one for me. I like completing things.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one other question. Somebody wrote in and said, Dawn, can you share a few of the titles of the books that you used for your research on the Camptown women?
I used primarily 2 books, Sex Among Allies by Catherine Moon and Koreans in Camptowns by Ji Yeon-yo. There was also a 3rd book I received, which was very exciting for me. On the tour in Korea, there was a book that was published in Bupyeong, and Bupyeong is just about maybe 40 minutes from the Incheon International Airport. It was the first camp town established during the Korean War. It was an old Japanese camp. So during Japanese occupation, there was a Japanese camp there. And so the US military moved in. It was already pretty much ready for them. They just altered it a bit, and there they were. And the camp town was already it was a town. So it was almost like they just moved in. The US military just moved in. And so they published a book in Korean. And I was on a tour with the same organization that I went with for the Hapa tour in 2014, me in Korea. And the woman who runs it, Min Young Kim, convinced them that they should translate it into English and give us all copies. That book came off the press the day we got there. And we were each given a copy of that book. And I do apologize, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was very fascinating for me to compare that book with the 2 that were published in America by Korean immigrants, and to see the difference in perspective, the similarities and the differences. There were a lot of personal stories in the one published out of Bupyeong. And it was, to me, a mark that Korea and the government are now acknowledging the presence of those camp towns, which for years and decades, it was a silent secret. So it's coming out.
I want to just share one last thing. As someone here at Textile Center, Ray and I both have our office in the back of the studio gallery where your exhibition is up. And I really want to encourage folks to make an appointment, come in and see the work. We get to hear all kinds of interesting comments, because I think sometimes people don't realize we're sitting here in the back of this gallery. But we hear a lot of comments about the work, this time particularly about how people have a very, I'm going to say, on a personal connection with work, because I think all of it is so much about the sense of place. Ian, with your work coming from nature and being, directly harvested by you, and, all the considerations you're thinking about. Erin, your work being so, apropos relevant right now, because we're, the destruction of Lake Street, the death of George, the murder of George Floyd, all that is just so present in our minds. And then Dawn, I'm going to share with you, we had a visitor come in yesterday, and she used to be a stewardess for Northwest Airlines, and actually held and received a number of the Hapa babies when they would fly with the people from the adoption centers over from Korea on the planes to the United States. And the stewardesses would help, but with carrying the babies off the planes and actually handing them to their adopted airports once they arrived in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so that was a really powerful conversation for me to have. I mean, it's such a pleasure to be able to engage in these sort of spontaneous things. I just wanted to share that with you. I'd be happy to connect you with her, but I just thought, oh my God, here's somebody who so many years ago was on the receiving end of those babies. And she made a comment that the babies just wanted to cling to whoever they were holding on to. And anyway, so, your work is touching a lot of people. It seems like a crazy time for us to be talking about exhibitions and having people come in and visit the work, but we're doing so very safely. And it's just been a really powerful thing for people to be able to come into Textile Center again and to see this show. And thank you. I mean, you guys did an amazing job working together, coming together with the installation. I just want to thank you from, on behalf of Textile Center for participating as fully as you did, given the crazy circumstances of this past year. So with that, does anyone else have any final comments before we wrap up the session for the day?
I'd like to thank the artists very much for this opportunity to have a glimpse of their work and the potential of what's going to come after this. And, just meeting you virtually is the first step. I look forward to more. Thank you.
And thank you, Pat and Tracy and Ray and Don and Erin and everyone that listened today.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. It's been an amazing year for me. Just, you start out with thoughts, but you don't really see what the year will bring. And it's been a wonderful, incredible year for me. Thank you for everything, everybody. The Jerome, the Textile Center, Pat, my cohorts, thank you all.
Okay, I think with that said, we're going to adjourn the panel for the day. And thanks, everybody. Have a terrific afternoon. And we're going to be in touch with you all very soon. Okay. Thanks, everyone.